identify the pathways and mechanisms that aid in students' post-secondary success, particularly in the areas of college remediation, course delivery models, and institutional structures. She has extensive experience designing and conducting mixed methods research projects in collaboration with external research partners, state departments of education and higher education governing bodies, and creating research products for both academic and practitioner and policymaker audiences. So basically, Dr. Fei will be going over how to do a qualitative research, all about the qualitative research methods. So if you have any questions, you can either type it in the chat box or ask during our Q&A session after Dr. Fei presents. And also, we will be having an attendance form for you to fill out to let us know that you have came to the seminar. So that link to the Google form will be posted during the Q&A session. So please stay for that too. All right, so let's have Dr. Fei speaks and present her PowerPoint. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on a Friday night for a research seminar. Glad you're joining us, and yay to all you Qualitative Methods fans out there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So everybody excuse me for just a moment while I bumble through this. Can you see this, and are you seeing the right part? Like, are you seeing the...
Yeah, we can see the title page.
Great. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for that presentation or the introduction. I really appreciate it. My name is Maggie Fei, and I am a research associate at the Community College Research Center at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. So I just wanted to start out with introductions. I'm going to ask you all to participate in the presentation this evening. And also, I really want you to feel free to ask questions. And I hope that the person moderating can let me know if questions are coming up in the chat, because I might miss them. But feel free to ask questions anytime, either in the chat or out loud. And when you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute. So I'll start by introducing myself. I am a social science researcher, and I use qualitative and mixed methods a lot in my work. I work at a research center at Columbia University called the Community College Research Center. And so we do research to try to improve outcomes for community college students, improving graduation rates and transfer rates. My research has really helped me to appreciate the value of student-led research projects. And so I really feel excited to participate in this College Leap research challenge because I think student research is really important. And so above all, I want you to feel like this was a productive hour that you'll spend with me, and that you've learned something useful about qualitative methods that you can use for your project. So again, please feel free to ask me questions anytime and interrupt with questions at any time. So I wanted to give everyone watching a chance to introduce themselves to me. So at this point, would you mind telling me in the chat just like where you are in the country or the world, and what you're considering for your research project for this research challenge? This would be great. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second so I can see. Oh, cool. COVID and students' mental health. That's great. Anyone else want to share where you are watching from and what you're planning to research as a part of this research challenge? Parents. Oh, cool. That is a good one. All right, I am going to move on with the presentation. Okay. The agenda, oops, sorry. Let me just see something here. Okay, the agenda for today's session, I'm going to start by just talking in a general way about research methods and the characteristics of qualitative versus quantitative methods. I'll talk about the major approaches to qualitative data collection, and then talk about what qualitative methods help us to understand and what kinds of research questions do qualitative methods address. What you'll learn today. So I hope by the end of this session, you will leave with a basic understanding of qualitative methods and when to use them, and what qualitative methods help us learn about social phenomena. And also to be able to think about whether qualitative methods are appropriate for your research project. So before we get into a discussion of qualitative methods specifically, I want to step back and just discuss methods, research methods in general. What are they? And qualitative methods are one type of research method. So research methods are approaches to gathering and analyzing data. They're also tools that we use to describe, explore, and explain social phenomena in an ethical fashion. And there are three main categories of research methods. There are qualitative methods, which are the focus of today's presentation. There are quantitative methods, and there are mixed methods. So I am going to talk about quantitative methods today, but in a really high level way, just kind of to strike a contrast between qualitative and quantitative approaches. There's an upcoming presentation, or sorry, an upcoming research seminar on quantitative methods that my colleague from the Community College Research Center is presenting on March 5th. And so I think that if you're interested in quantitative methods, or after this presentation, you decide that quantitative methods are a better fit for your research project, I would really encourage you to attend that session where you'll learn a lot more in depth about quantitative methods. I also won't go into a lot of depth about mixed methods during this presentation, except for to just mention that they exist. And mixed methods are research projects that use both qualitative and quantitative data. And I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like a little bit later in this presentation. So I thought I would start with just textbook definitions of qualitative versus quantitative methods. Qualitative methods collect and analyze information about the social world that cannot be readily converted to numeric form. And quantitative methods seek to obtain and analyze information about the social world that can be converted to numeric form. And then these data are analyzed using statistical analyses. So in other words, another way to say this is that qualitative methods analyze words and behaviors, while quantitative methods analyze numbers. Qualitative methods are concerned with understanding meaning, experiences, and motivations. You can think of qualitative methods as kind of getting at the quality of social phenomena. And I don't mean quality in terms of value, but in terms of understanding the aspects of human and social experiences that cannot be quantified. So in this section of the presentation, I am going to give an overview of qualitative versus quantitative methods and discuss their key differences. I'll also discuss advantages and disadvantages to each approach, and just some things that you will want to keep in mind as you think about, which approach might be best for your research project and in designing research in general. So qualitative and quantitative methods are often framed as being in tension with one another. You may have heard people have arguments about whether qualitative or quantitative approaches are better and which approach is more rigorous. I think a better way to think about qualitative and quantitative methods is that they both bring different strengths to analyzing social phenomena. So each method can shed light on different aspects of social phenomena. And each method is used to answer different types of research questions. So some researchers, as I mentioned, use both approaches together in a single research project to kind of shed light on questions from different angles. So the key differences between qualitative and quantitative methods are data types, data collection, sample sizes, and then generalizability of results, which is connected to sample sizes, and then the types of questions each method is best suited to answer. So I'm going to go through each of these differences one by one. So one important difference between qualitative and quantitative methods is that they use different kinds of data. So qualitative approaches use conversations and observations as data. Usually qualitative researchers collect their own data by going out into the field and observing and interviewing people. Qualitative data is also usually relational, which means that you have to interact with your research subjects in order to collect data. Quantitative data, on the other hand, so this is an example of what a quantitative data set could look like. They're just spreadsheets with a lot of information in them, usually about people. Quantitative data usually draws on pre-existing data sets, like publicly available survey data or administrative data sets that you can just grab off a website or like pull off a shelf. You don't have to collect your own quantitative data, although you could by designing a survey. And so because most quantitative work uses pre-existing data, quantitative researchers don't have to interact with their research subjects. So this is another contrast between the two approaches. Because quantitative research usually uses pre-existing data, there isn't a lot of emphasis in quantitative methods on data collection, but data collection is a very big part of qualitative methods. There are a lot of ways to collect qualitative data. The bullets that I've included here kind of represent the most frequently, commonly used approaches to qualitative data collection. So the first one is interviews, which is just talking to people one-on-one. Usually researchers record interviews, or you could take very close notes while you're interviewing. But usually people record and then they take that audio file and they transcribe it. And then the transcript of that interview is your data that you analyze for your research. So focus groups, the second bullet, is another approach, which is just talking to people in groups versus talking to people one-on-one. So talking to people in groups might make sense if you are interested in learning about community college students, student athletes, community college faculty. In other words, people who share a role. It may make more sense and be more efficient to speak to several of those people at once. And then focus groups, it's the same process as with interviews. You would record those conversations or you would take very close notes. And then the transcript that you have, that is your data for your project. For both interviews and focus groups, you need to design an interview protocol, which is a series of questions that you would ask everybody, which would help you shed light on your research questions. And then the final bullet here is participant observation. So participant observation means participating in / observing an activity to learn about it and to uncover meaning that people participating in an activity attribute to their own actions. So in participant observation, you would interact with other participants in this activity and you would take notes and interact with those people and those notes, which we call field notes in research speak, that would be your data for your study. So an example of participant observation could be like, maybe you would want to learn about how classroom interactions have changed for community college students who are learning remotely. And so in that case, you could do a participant observation in one of your own classes and take notes on how students interact with each other and the faculty member. And those notes would be your data for that study. So something to keep in mind here, if you're considering using interviews or focus groups for your project, you have to turn those audio files into transcripts that you can analyze, right? So if you are transcribing your own data, like if you're listening to those audio files and writing it all out, that can be very time consuming. You can pay people to do this for you. There are transcription services that are easy to find if you Google them, but they're pretty expensive. So they usually charge about $1 per minute of audio file to transcribe it, which if you have 45-minute, 2-hour-long interviews, that can add up pretty fast. A lot of colleges have free transcription software that's available, so that might be something worth looking into if you're considering doing interviewing. Another thing to keep in mind is that a 45-minute, 2-hour-long interview can easily produce 20 pages of transcript data. And if you interview 10 people, that's 200 pages of data that you will need to read and analyze. Oops. Sorry. So that is just something to keep in mind as you think about your project timeline and how many people you want to interview is like how you're going to process and analyze all that data. So I'm just going to pause for questions real quick in case anybody has any at this point. They can just put them in the chat. Okay, no questions so far, but feel free to ask anytime. All right, so moving on. Okay, so another important difference between qualitative and quantitative methods is sample size. So a sample is the group of people that you're using to focus on to conduct your research. So qualitative methods usually have relatively small samples, while quantitative approaches use large samples. So a quantitative study would probably need a minimum of 100 research participants. So if we think back to that spreadsheet that I showed you before, that would be a spreadsheet with 100 columns on it, representing data on 100 different people. But 100 is actually small for a quantitative study. Like most quantitative studies have, thousands or even millions of participants. But due to the nature of qualitative data collection, because it is based on conversations and observations, it's just very difficult to have large sample sizes in qualitative research. So for example, it would be really labor intensive for one researcher to interview 100 people, since interviews are usually about an hour long. So for qualitative studies, a large qualitative study would have maybe 60 to 100 participants, 60 to 80 participants in it. And that's big. And it's fine for a qualitative study to have way less people than that, ranging from maybe like 5 to 15, that would be okay. So something to keep in mind as you design your research is, what is a realistic sample size? So you'll need to bear in mind that you're going to need to recruit people into your study and schedule time to speak with all of them. Scheduling and recruiting is really time consuming. Also, it's often necessary to pay people or incentivize them in some way to participate in your study, especially if you're like interviewing strangers. So these again are just factors to keep in mind as you design your study. So things to keep in mind about sample size for qualitative work: don't interview more people than you need to. So, think about how many people you'll need to speak to in order to gain meaningful insights about your research question. So your research question should, to some extent, guide how many people you think it's necessary to speak to in order to learn something meaningful about that research question. It's also important to think about your target population and how hard it might be to identify and find enough of this kind of person, and how difficult it might be to recruit them into your study. So like, for example, if you were interested in learning about non-documented immigrant students or gender non-conforming students, it's just important to keep in mind that these particular populations might be challenging to identify and to recruit into your study. In contrast, like if you wanted to learn from community college faculty, it's easy to find a lot of them. And I think they would probably be willing to participate in student research without incentives. And then finally, just something to think about is like, will you need to incentivize people, to provide an incentive to get them to participate in your study? If you don't have a budget for paying people to participate in research, you might want to think about other ways you could entice people to participate in your study. So you can offer food during interviews and focus groups. That's often a really good way to get students to participate. Another thing that you can do is frame study participation as a way for people to kind of get their voices heard on an issue. So for example, if you wanted to interview students about challenges to transfer during the COVID pandemic, you could frame interviews as a way that those students could, let the college administration know about barriers to transfer, and that this is an opportunity to improve transfer for students in the future. And so framing research like that can sometimes incentivize people to participate. Okay, so another difference between qualitative and quantitative methods is the generalizability of study results. Oh, sorry, I see something in the chat, so I'm just gonna check it real quick. How can you get an estimation of how many people you need to interview? Is there a standard number for the results to be credible? Okay, great question, Jessica. No, you don't. I don't think there's really a required number for qualitative work. A lot of qualitative studies that like publish in journals and things like that will have, 30 to 60 participants typically. I think that would probably be a lot for a student research project. I think, depending on how many people are on your team and what you think is realistic, 10 to 15 would probably be a good number. And we're gonna, a little later in this presentation, I'll get to hear about your research questions. So maybe we can circle back to this. Again, I think you would need to think about, given your research questions, how many people do you think you would need to hear from to say something credible, as you say, about your findings? If I was just gonna guess, I think 5 to 15 people would be fine. Okay, another question is, are surveys considered quantitative data research? I think surveys kind of can straddle the line a little bit. For this presentation, I'm considering surveys to be quantitative because surveys usually are, you convert surveys into a database, like a numeric database, and then you analyze the numeric responses that people provide. So I'm not really going into survey research in this presentation, but my colleague who is presenting on quantitative methods, I believe she'll go into survey design. So I will mention that to her. Thanks for your questions, guys. Keep them coming. Okay. So Okay, another difference between qualitative and quantitative methods is generalizability of results. So generalizability, this is related to sample size. Generalizability means basically that whatever results you find from your research, that you would be able to generalize that to another population and context. So, whatever you find to be true in your research, could you then make a prediction about other people in other contexts based on what you have found? Qualitative research is generally considered to be less generalizable, and quantitative research is generally considered to be more generalizable. Qualitative approaches use small samples of research participants, as I mentioned, and usually qualitative methods tend to take a really in-depth look at a phenomena in a small group of people. Because qualitative methods usually look at a small group of people in just one context, the results of those studies are not considered to be generalizable. So whatever you find in that group of people in that place is true for them, but it's not necessarily, it would be hard to make an argument that it would be true for other people in another place. So I'll just give you an example. So let's say, for example, you were studying how the pandemic was affecting community college student athletes, and you find that at your community college, a lot of student athletes have dropped out because of the pandemic. So that might also be true at other community colleges and for other groups of student athletes, but it would be very hard for you to credibly make that argument based on a small sample at a single college. Quantitative methods, in contrast, quantitative methods tend to use large samples to explore relationships between variables in large samples in order to make predictions about how those variables will relate in other populations and other contexts. So in this illustration here, this study, is looking at the relationship between high school grade point average and SAT scores. And we can see from this illustration that they find a positive relationship. So students who have high high school GPAs have high SAT scores. And so because this research is drawing on a large sample of people, these researchers could argue that this positive relationship between high school GPA and SAT scores would not just be true for this sample, but would be true in general. So that these findings are more generalizable. Again, so this gets a little bit more technical and complicated, and I would really encourage folks considering using quantitative methods to attend that presentation on March 5th to learn more about generalizability. Another difference between qualitative and quantitative methods is that they're better suited for answering different types of questions. So qualitative methods, these questions on the left, are more interested in answering why and how questions. So I have a couple of examples here that I will read to you that are examples of qualitative type questions. So how do students describe their experiences with transfer to four-year colleges? How do faculty members perceive the use of Zoom in the classroom and why? And why do the majority of students drop out of developmental courses in community colleges? So qualitative methods are really interested in getting at what are people's experiences and understanding why variables relate to each other in a particular way. What are the processes that make variables relate to each other in a particular way? Quantitative methods are more interested in what and how questions, but it's a different kind of how than the qualitative how. So these are a couple of examples of more quantitative type questions. So what is the relationship between post-secondary attainment and wages? So this question is getting at, for students who are in associate's degrees or bachelor's degrees, how much money do they make once they enter the labor market? How does taking developmental courses in community colleges affect students' likelihood of graduating? And what is the relationship between GPA and SAT scores, referencing that illustration we saw on the past slide? So quantitative methods are really interested in what is the relationship between variables, how does one variable influence another variable, and quantitative methods tend to focus on outcomes. So for example, here, like the outcome would be wages, or here the outcome would be graduation. So in summary, quantitative questions tend to focus on relationships between variables and outcomes, while quantitative questions tend to focus on processes driving relationships and processes driving those outcomes. So another way to say this is that qualitative methods are interested in understanding mechanisms that are underlying relationships between variables. So going back once again to this illustration that we saw of the relationship between SAT score and high school GPA, the qualitative questions related to this question would be why? Why is there a positive relationship between grade point average and SAT scores? So I think we could all imagine a lot of reasons why students with high grades would get good SAT scores, but qualitative work would seek to understand those mechanisms. So these are just a couple of areas that qualitative work could look into. Like maybe the mechanism driving this relationship is test prep. Maybe students who have high SAT scores, they get to participate in a lot of test prep, and that's why they have good SAT scores. Maybe students with good grades and good SAT scores went to better high schools, and so it's the schools that's driving that relationship. Maybe students with good GPAs and high test scores have really ambitious parents who push them to participate in test prep and are very pushy about their grades. Another thing we could look into is, what about students who have high GPAs but get low SAT scores? Like, what could we learn about the relationship between test performance and grades by looking at the experiences of students who don't fit into this pattern? I'm going to pause for questions here, see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay. So moving on, I wanted to give you all a couple of examples of what qualitative and quantitative questions, research questions can look like. So these are examples from my dissertation research. So when you do a PhD, you do a big research project at the end. And as part of this research project, you are answering research questions. So my dissertation was a mixed methods project. So I used both qualitative and quantitative data. So these are qualitative and quantitative questions. My dissertation research focused on students who take remedial math courses in community colleges. I don't know if you all know what remedial courses are. They're also called developmental courses. Basically, students have to take these courses based on their performance on a placement test when they enter a community college, and they have to complete these courses before they can access college level English and math courses. So they're sort of like a prerequisite. And I was interested in students who fail or withdraw from and have to repeat these courses in order to make academic progress, which I call repeaters in my study. Okay, so I'm going to go through these questions and sort of talk about the characteristics of quantitative versus qualitative research questions. So the first two questions here are quantitative questions. So the first question is, how widespread is course repetition in remedial math courses in community colleges? So in this question, one way that you can tell that this is a quantitative question is that it starts with how widespread. So this question is really trying to get at just how common is this behavior in a population of students. And so in my case, I used that quantitative data. I had course taking data from the university system. So I used the quantitative course taking data just to look at how many students had repeated these remedial courses. So this is an example of a question that I think you could tackle it quantitatively or qualitatively. Like you could imagine a qualitative way to answer this question, which would be to just interview a lot of students in remedial math courses and ask them, like, have you ever failed and withdrawn from and repeated a course, and counted up how many people said yes and how many people said no. But this would be a really inefficient way to answer this question. So in this case, using course taking data is just a better strategy for answering this question about how common is this behavior. The second question is, how likely are repeaters to attempt and pass college level math courses? And so something that indicates that this is a quantitative question is the focus on outcomes, and it's also trying to get at that relationship between variables. So it's looking at, what is the relationship between repeating, which is one variable, and performance in college level math, which is another variable. And then the second two questions are more qualitative questions. So these questions are, how does repeating courses affect post-secondary motivation and goals? And what motivates students to repeat or retake courses? So you can tell that these are qualitative questions because of the word motivation. Questions that try to get at like experiences and feelings and motivation and goals, basically things that you wouldn't be able to observe about a person unless they told you. Those all kind of indicate qualitative approaches to answering those questions and using things like interviews and focus groups as data. So, as I was kind of trying to illustrate in the last slide, a lot of questions, you could tackle it with qualitative methods or quantitative methods, but usually one methodology or another provides the more efficient strategy for answering your question, or it will produce data that will just give you better information to answer that question. So as you all think about your research questions and then the methods that those research questions might point to, I would encourage you to just think about these questions. Given what you want to answer, what would be the best data to help you answer that question? And then number two, like just think about, in terms of narrowing down to a research question, like what questions can you realistically answer? What is possible given the time and the resources that you have available to you? So I'm gonna just give us a minute here for a little participation, and I'm hoping that you all will share in the chat, like what are the research questions that you're considering? And if you have any sense of what methods you're planning to use, you could share those too.
So any of you that might have a research question in mind can either type in the chat box, or you can just speak up right now and like just unmute yourself.
Okay, so one person is thinking about how are community college students' happiness level affected during the COVID pandemic? And you're thinking of using surveys. Okay, cool. That sounds interesting. How are community college students? You could also, surveys would be a way to tackle this question. You could also do interviews or focus groups. Surveys for this question, surveys might be a way to get at a slightly bigger population of students, which would help you get at that generalizability question of like, how widespread are the findings among community college students? And then using interviews or focus groups might help you get like more detailed information about how COVID is affecting students' psychological health. Thanks for sharing that. Does anybody else have, okay. Also concerned interviews might be too personal. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is true. I don't know. I mean, I think interviews often kind of try to ask people to share what ends up being personal information. You could do one-on-one interviews, which would give people more privacy. And usually when you interview people, you ensure to them that you wouldn't share information from the interview with others, and that what they're sharing with you is confidential. And you might just think about posing questions in a very open-ended way, where you're not making people share really private confessional information with you, but you're just, kind of framing it more as how have you been feeling during the pandemic? Has it had an impact on your levels of anxiety? What have your concerns been? So you could kind of raise these questions in a less personal, potentially emotionally triggering way, and just see how people respond to it. Okay, let me see. Are there other ways to collect data besides interviews? Yes. Well, so in terms of qualitative approaches, there's one-on-one interviews. You can speak to people in groups. So you could speak to a group of people at once, like a group of students. You can also, I talked about doing participant observation at the beginning. So you can participate in activities that would allow you to just observe what is happening in a context and sort of just interact with people in a way that would be appropriate in that context. So the example I gave at the beginning of the presentation was if you wanted to look at how remote learning has changed classroom interactions, you could do research in one of your own classes and just take notes on how students interact with each other, how they interact with the faculty member. Another way to collect data, if you want to use quantitative approaches, is to use publicly available data sets. There are surveys that are publicly available that have data on all kinds of topics. So you could, again, I think this is something that my colleague will go over in the presentation on the 5th. So you could just use publicly available data and do analyses using that data. Okay. Kate says, my topic is the effects of COVID-19 on international aviation industry. Question that I'm considering, how did the COVID-19 change your travel plans? Oh, that would be cool. Are you planning to use interviews for that, Kate, or surveys? Do you have any plans as far as that goes? Not planned yet. Yeah, so were you thinking of speaking to travelers, people who are traveling, not people in the aviation industry? Yeah, so I mean, so interesting. That might be one where it might be useful to use a survey, depending on how many people you want to reach out to, you could probably get a lot more data on how COVID has impacted people's travel plans if you can send out a survey, maybe within your college or within your social network. And again, if you wanted to get more in-depth information, you could complement surveys with interviews to find out more details about how COVID has impacted people's travel plans. Well, thanks everybody for sharing your potential research questions. It sounds like you all have interesting topics that you're working on. So I'm going to just move into sharing a couple of examples of just for folks who are still kind of not quite there for their research questions, of how to move from a research topic to a research question to thinking about a methodology. So this is this part in bold here. This is a sample from the topic that College Leap provided for the psychology track. Some of you might have participated in the research seminar a couple of weeks ago on creating a research topic. And so research topics are usually broader than research questions. So to move from a research topic to a research question, you usually have to think about like narrowing down. And so to narrow down, you might want to think about how could I ask a specific question that I would be able to get an answer to that sheds light on this kind of larger topic. So how does COVID-19 influence students' psychological health? I think some of you are actually considering using this as a research topic. So here I've just created a couple of questions for how you could maybe tackle this topic in a more specific way. So this question, like how does COVID influence college students' psychological health? To me, that's a very broad question that you could imagine answering in a lot of different ways. So here, the questions that I drafted to try to get more specific with this question are, how do community college students manage their psychological health during the COVID-19 pandemic? What supports do students use? Institutional supports, family supports, other students, other things? And what are the psychological health needs that are underaddressed for community college students? So there's two things here that I think kind of make this question a little more specific, potentially a little bit more answerable. Rather than talking about college students in general, I would focus on a more specific population. So here I just say community college students. You could get even more specific than that and say, students who are parents, traditional age community college students, students who are planning to transfer. And then rather than just thinking about how does the pandemic affect psychological health in general, I instead was thinking about, well, what strategies do students use to manage their psychological health during the COVID-19 pandemic? So you could imagine addressing this qualitatively by interviewing community college students and designing a protocol that would help you understand what their experiences have been during the pandemic and how that has influenced their psychological health, and identifying the main strategies that they use to manage their mental health and what supports they feel that they lack. And so this is another example from College Leap for the sociology track. And so the question that they provided was, how does children's internet usage affect the work from home policy? So this again is like a pretty broad question as it's stated right now. So I think that we would need to think about more specific ways to ask this question that would help us kind of shed light on this larger topic. So the questions that I drafted to kind of get at this larger topic were, how do community college students with college-age children manage their own academic work and childcare during the COVID-19 pandemic? And how does children's internet usage affect student parents' ability to manage their own academic responsibilities? So I was thinking, you could see children's internet usage maybe being a positive for parents because it allows them to spend time on their own work and responsibilities. Maybe it puts a lot of pressure on the broadband in the house, and so that's challenging. Maybe it's creating other challenges in the household. So you could investigate all these kinds of questions using qualitative methods. So I was imagining a design where you would have interviews or focus groups with community college students with children to understand how they balance their own college coursework with supporting their children's online schooling, and trying to understand how children's internet usage affects those parents' ability to complete their own coursework. So these are just a few examples of how to move from a topic to research questions to methods. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay. So I'm moving into just a summary now of some of the stuff that we've learned today about qualitative methods versus quantitative methods. So the big takeaways here are qualitative methods use non-numeric data, often interviews or focus groups. Qualitative methods focus on an in-depth examination of small samples. These methods often try to understand how things happen or the processes underlying relationships between variables. Qualitative work tends to have less emphasis on deriving inferences or predicting patterns. So this is getting back to that generalizability issue. Qualitative work tends to not make claims about how these results would affect another population. And qualitative work requires often extensive contact between researchers and research subjects. Quantitative data quantitative methods uses numeric data. It usually uses pre-existing data sets that you can just grab off a website and use. Quantitative work tends to have large sample sizes. It explores the relationships between variables and focuses on outcomes. And it does seek to derive inferences and make predictions about how how the relationship between variables in one population would generalize to another population in another context. And quantitative methods usually require limited contact between researchers and subjects. So as you all kind of consider your research questions and what kind of methods you would want to use to answer them, I thought I would offer up just some pros and cons to think about with qualitative and quantitative methods. It might be more realistic to think of these as potential limitations rather than cons. It's really kind of a judgment call, what would be a pro or a con, and it depends on your perspective. So for qualitative work, on the pro side, you get to interact with your research subjects, which can be fun if you like interacting with people. You get to collect your own data, which I think is cool. So you get to design exactly what you want to ask people about a specific topic. Qualitative methods help you understand how and why things happen. On the con side, you have to collect your own data, which can be time consuming and potentially expensive. And you have to interact with your subjects, which can be a con depending on your perspective. On the quantitative side, in the pro column, you don't need to interact with research subjects. So if you're like a loner and you don't like interacting with people, quantitative might be a good way for you to go. And you don't have to collect your own data, which saves time and potentially money. And in the con side, you don't have to interact with research subjects, which if you like people and you find interaction fun, then that might be a downside for you. And also for quantitative approaches, you do need some knowledge of statistical analyses in order to analyze your data. So that is the end of my presentation. And I can take questions if anybody has them. Or you can email me. So, okay, so Jessica has a question. Would subjects tend to be biased on a survey form? I'll try to minimize the bias from responses. I think it depends on what you're asking people. I think a lot of times people think self-reported data can be biased. Yeah. So like, for example, if you're asking people about how much effort they devote to a class or like, their study habits, I think oftentimes self-reported data, people will kind of not be realistic and see their academic behaviors as possibly more positive than they really are. So that is something to keep in mind with survey data. Depending on what you're asking people, they may not respond honestly. Any other questions?
Hi, would it be okay if I unmuted?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for such a helpful kind of like distinction between the two. I found this very helpful. I wasn't really as aware. I feel like I got a lot out of it. And I also, I guess a lot of us as community students, we really appreciate what you do, community college students. So thank you.
Yeah,
And so for me, I think I'm really interested in like the whole qualitative approach. I really enjoy like human interaction. I think that it has like specifically for us just studying in an online environment, I think like having less of that face-to-face interaction, collaboration with students like next to us, seeing them working hard next to us, I think it had a really positive impact on how we performed academically too. So I'm really interested in kind of finding out like, it's a little bit similar to that COVID-19 question, but I wanted to gear it kind of more towards like what can be done, maybe specifically, like even at De Anza, like our community college, or like what can be done to kind of like alleviate the effects that it has had on us psychologically, like the pandemic, on how we study and just how everything that we're experiencing in our college experiences. So I wanted to find a way to gear the questions towards finding ways of how they think schools can help them in this whole
yeah.
journey. So I just wanted to ask you for any advice on like the sorts of questions that I would ask. And I guess like, does it have to be like, I know that the more random the sample is, sometimes it's a lot better. So I don't know
Yeah.
how to like put all my thoughts into creating like the right questions.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I would just react to there. I'm really glad this was useful for you. So random sampling, I'm sure that in the quantitative presentation, my colleague will talk about this, but yeah, you would generally want to have a sample that resembles your community college overall, right? So you might want to do, as like a starting point, you could maybe look at the demographics of your community college. How many men, what percentage of men, what percentage of women, different racial categories, high school dual enrolled students versus traditional age students who are like 18 to 22 versus older students. And you would want to try to recruit a sample that would sort of mirror the composition of the community college overall. So if you have a representative sample, then that usually gives more credibility to your findings. And so it seems like, I'll just say that research is a great way to do activism, right? And so if you want to persuade the administration at your college to do things differently to help students, research is a really good way to do that. Because you can say, look, I had a representative sample. I believe that the findings from my study give us credible information about, psychological effects of COVID-19 for students at this college. And these are my findings, and this is what I think you should do. That would be really helpful for an administration to hear, I think, and it would be something that they would pay attention to. So I really think you should do this project. I think it sounds cool. So I mean, I would say, yeah, you should do it. It'll be great. And your research, I mean, usually research, you would identify a few themes based on what students tell you. So this could be, I don't know what you would find with this study, but it might be something like students are experiencing a lot more anxiety. They're having a really hard time focusing on their studies. And based on the things that you identify, you would talk about some implications for the college of things that they could do to address these problems. I mean, so something I might do if I was collecting data on this is you could, use those open-ended questions of just asking students like, what has your experience been like during the pandemic? How has it affected, like, are you feeling optimistic about your academic progress? Like, are you as motivated about school as you were before? What strategies are you using to help yourself stay engaged in
And
school,
then,
be a successful student, and like, what do you wish that you had that you don't have? That could be like
is
a
it
good way.
possible to like fully ask, what do you think that we're lacking, that if it was there, it would help you in this scenario?
Totally. Yes, I would ask that question for sure. I mean, I think I would try to design a survey or design research interview questions, sort of getting at, like, when you just leave it open-ended, what do students tell you about how the pandemic is affecting, you know, their outlook, their ability to stay engaged in school, just how they're feeling. And then, you know, you could ask them, like, what strategies do you use and what resources do you wish you had that you don't? And that might help you.
Sense.
Yeah, that might help you point to some things for the administration of, like, look, students are saying that they wish they had more access to counseling services. So it would be good for the college to expand counseling services to students.
And I really like what you said about the representative sample. So with that, I'm wondering if I could at all generalize this to like colleges in general, or like undergraduate studies, student experiences during the pandemic in general, and how we can, like, colleges or support can improve that, or if I would have to stick to saying, like, that's about my community college with this representative sample.
It depends on how big your sample is. So I think with doing interviews, I don't know how many people you have on your team, but it's hard to do interviews with a big sample of people. But so if you only collect data from students at your college, I think that you would be in a good position to say something about students in your college. And if your college is kind of similar to other colleges in the other community colleges in the area, you could make the argument that, like, what you found is probably relevant to other community colleges too. So I think it would basically be like, if the population at your college is similar, and your representative sample would be similar to other college populations in the area, community colleges or four-year colleges, if you see similarities, you could make that argument that your data might shed light on issues that students are facing in college in general, in college in your region. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your help. I found this incredibly helpful. Thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Does anyone else have any questions? Other questions that you may ask?
Also, I've provided my email here. So if people want to email me and ask questions about your research as you move forward, that would be fine too. And I can give you feedback.
Since I don't see any questions typed in the chat box, I guess that this webinar is coming to an end. If Jasmine, you can send the attendance form link to everyone so that they can fill out the link and let us know that you've been here throughout the webinar, that would be great. And so Dr. Faye already had her email posted in the PowerPoint. So if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to her and ask. So thank you all for coming to this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Bye, everyone. Have a good Friday.